Hi everyone, and welcome to Making of Mondays. In this week's episode, we are going to go over the editing I did on the image we shot last week. Here's the image as it was out of the camera. I do want to point out one thing, and that is about the lighting. If you watched last week's video, you will note that the lighting here is slightly different from what you saw me shooting. I actually had to reshoot this because I realized when I was editing it that in order to put it together the way that I wanted to, the lighting that I had originally chosen was not going to make sense. And it's actually very important, even though this is a surrealist image, that everything appear realistic so that the image can be believable to the viewer. As you can see, I wanted to make it so that Patrick's face is being eclipsed by the moon. So it's very important that the light be set up in such a way that it makes sense that if this object is moving over his face in this direction, that this is the shadow that it would cast on his face. So we had to redo the image. This is the harder directional lighting setup. I had the Cinefoil on it. I did add a tiny bit of fill light so you can get a little more detail down here. And I actually had him hold the moon in front of his face while I stood with the camera at the angle that I would be shooting from, so that I could see exactly how the shadow of the moon would fall on his face to make sure that it matches what I'm doing here. So I just wanted to point that out, and when you're shooting these kinds of images, you're gonna make mistakes like this because sometimes you don't think it all through ahead of time, but it is very, very important. If you want the image to be believable, you're gonna have to think about things like this. So let's go ahead and get started on the editing. The first thing that I want to do is make some very slight color adjustments. I am going to make one adjustment that I do fairly frequently to remove the redness in the skin. So this is just a general adjustment that I do on a lot of my images to remove the redness from the skin. And as you can see, it works pretty well. So here's before and after. So now we're going to add a curves adjustment layer. Okay, so I think that looks pretty good. And this is pretty subtle what I've done here. We'll do before and after, so you can see it's just a little subtle tonality adjustment. It warms the image up a little bit. And this is also good for printing because it makes the tones in the image richer. All right, so that's all we're gonna do for color adjusting at this point. And we are going to move on to adding our moon. First, I'll need to open up my image of the moon that I chose, which is going to be this one. So let's go ahead and get that open. Okay, so we just need to select the moon. There's a few different ways you could do this. You could use the quick selection tool, which is this one here. Right here. You can also just press W on your keyboard in order to open that up. And as you can see, because this is the only really lit object in this image, it's going to very quickly and easily select the entire object for you. That's one way you can do it. You can also use the pen tool, which will be pretty easy on this object because it's a circular object, so you wouldn't have to do a ton of work. The pen tool is going to make for typically a much more precise selection, especially the more detailed you get about it. For our purposes today, I think I am actually going to go ahead and use the pen tool. So I'm going to quickly do this. Okay, we now have our moon outlined with the pen tool. In order to turn this into a selection, we're going to right click and choose Make Selection. I'm actually not going to feather this at all, so I'm just going to click OK. I am going to go into Select and Mask, and I'm going to do a little bit of refining on this selection. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm using the Refine Edge tool to further smooth out the edge between the moon and its background. You want to be careful when you're doing this, because if you do it too much, you can actually feather the edges of the image so much that it will make it so that part of the object is not fully opaque. And in an image like what we're going to do right now, where this moon is going to be directly in front of our subject's face, that will be quite obvious, so you don't want that to happen. So I'm switching over to the regular brush, and I'm making it a pretty hard brush, and I'm actually brushing out to the edges just to make sure that I'm not going to have that problem and that my selection will be opaque while still having a soft edge that will blend properly when we add it to our image. I am also going to smooth the edge just a bit. I think that's looking pretty good, so we're going to click OK. And then we're going to go ahead and copy the moon over into our image. So we'll do that by clicking Command C if you're using a Mac. I think it's Control C if you're using a PC. And then we're going to come over to our image, and we're going to click Command or Control V to paste it. All right, and then the next thing we need to do is we're going to transform the moon so that we have it the size that we want it, and we're going to move it in front of his face where we would like it to be. Okay, actually before we jump into the color, we want to add our moon shadow. So in order to do that, I'm just going to go to our moon layer. I'm going to right click on it and select pixels. And that's going to select our moon. I'm then going to add a new layer. You can do that by clicking the new layer icon down here. And then I'm going to drag that layer below the moon, and I'm going to fill the layer with black. There's a few ways you can do this. You can go to Edit, Fill, and then choose black, and you want it 100%. And there you go, you've got it filled with black. So what I'm doing now is I'm just moving the shadow to place it where I want it, and I'm also blurring it quite a bit because we don't want the edge to be quite so hard. And last, I'm going to go ahead and lower the opacity. Now we'll go ahead and do our color adjustments. So we're going to start with a color balance adjustment layer, and I want to clip this layer to my moon because I don't want it to affect any other part of the image except for the moon. So there's a couple ways you can do that. You can right click here and choose Create Clipping Mask, or you can also do the keyboard shortcut Option Command G. Okay, so what I'm doing now is I'm adding color adjustments to my moon. So I'm starting with a color balance, and as you can probably tell, the moon was looking very green, and I don't want it looking green. I want it more of a bluish hue. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm also going to desaturate the moon a bit. And I will add a final color balance layer to make sure I have everything looking exactly how I would like it. Okay, so I have done a few additional adjustments to the color on the moon, and I think I have it looking the way that I would like it to look. So we're going to go ahead and add a shadow over the moon. I want it to look as if the moon is emerging from the shadows over here, coming into the light and passing over his face. So we're just going to add a shadow on this side. Okay, so what I'm doing now is I'm just using the pen tool to create a selection in the shape of the shadow that I am going to place over the moon. I'm going to make that pen path into a selection, and I feathered it pretty heavily. And now I am filling it with black and then blurring that even further. And then we're going to just do a little transforming on it to make sure that it's covering the moon in the way that I want it to. And we're pretty much set. Okay, so now we have our moon. Our final steps are going to be to add our texture. As I said in a previous video, I continually use the same texture on these particular images, and that is this texture that makes them appear a little bit like an old photograph. So this looks like an old damaged negative, and we're just going to copy and paste that. So what I'm doing here is I'm just going to paste that texture onto my image, and I'm going to lower the opacity and change the blending mode. Blending modes are a really good way to get creative with your images. I really do recommend you try those out. And on this one, we are actually going to use 2 texture layers. And then we're just going to put our final touches on the image. I'm going to add a final curves layer to adjust the contrast. And then the last thing we're going to do is we're going to sharpen the image. And I typically do that using a high pass filter. And here we have our final image.